Welcome to this Master Level Explainer. Today, we're going to completely flip your understanding of corporate misconduct on its head. We almost always treat ethical failures as a problem of bad actors, but drawing on the brilliant work of Dr. Erlander Johnson, we're going to see how it's actually, far more frequently a problem of bad architecture.
So let's just dive right in with a pretty provocative question. If we assume that most professionals out there don't just wake up in the morning wanting to cause harm or cheat their clients, why are large-scale organizational failures so incredibly common? Like, why do everyday, well-intentioned folks end up participating in systemic wrongdoing?
To figure that out, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, the bad apple myth. Then, blind spots and wiggle room, licensing and slippery slopes, what happens when metrics displace morals, groups and role morality, and finally, designing ethical architecture.
All right, part one, the bad apple myth. Let's start by challenging that really reassuring story we always hear after a massive corporate scandal. You know the one. The idea that ethical failures are just caused by bad people weighing the risks and actively deciding to cheat. It's a super comforting narrative, right? Because it implies we just need to fire the bad apples to fix the whole problem. But spoiler alert, it's almost always wrong.
To really grasp this, we've got to distinguish between two different approaches. Standard ethics asks what an agent ought to do, and obviously holds them accountable when they fail. But behavioral ethics, that shifts the whole diagnostic focus. It asks what structural and cognitive conditions make ethical behavior likely in the first place. So we're adding the institution to the equation without, subtracting the agent's personal responsibility.
And this brings us to a foundational concept coined by Bazerman and Ten Brunsell called bounded ethicality. Basically, just as we have bounded rationality that limits our logic, our cognitive architecture also produces these systematic, totally predictable gaps between our ethical intentions and our actual behavior. So it's really not about having a bad character, it's about our cognitive limits clashing with institutional contexts.
Moving on to Section 2, blind spots and wiggle room. Let's look at how our brains actively trick us into unethical behavior without us even realizing it.
This table really illustrates the core mechanisms of bounded ethicality. You've got ethical fading, where moral dimensions just sort of vanish behind business jargon. You have motivated reasoning, but what I find absolutely fascinating is moral wiggle room. This is where people deliberately choose not to know how their actions affect others. It literally allows them to act selfishly while perfectly preserving their self-image as, totally fair and honest people.
Take a mortgage broker, for instance. Through ethical fading, a broker might gradually shift from giving highly accurate product descriptions to, slightly more optimistic ones. Because the whole decision is framed purely as a business problem, just closing the deal. Totally different regulatory schemas activate in the brain. They aren't making a conscious decision to mislead anyone. The moral consequences just quietly recede from view.
Similarly, imagine an auditor whose firm relies on massive fees from a huge client. Through motivated reasoning, that auditor might unconsciously apply much greater scrutiny to unwelcome financial findings while just readily accepting evidence that makes the client look good. And the terrifying part? They experience themselves as being completely rigorous and independent the entire time. The bias is 100% unconscious.
All right, Section 3, licensing and slippery slopes. What's really wild about this next part is how our own internal moral ledger can actually be weaponized against us.
The first trap is moral licensing. Basically, people keep a running internal account of their moral standing. When you do a good deed, you credit the account. But when that balance gets high enough, it can actually relax your constraints. It's kind of like eating a salad for lunch, so you feel totally justified ordering a huge chocolate cake for dinner. In the corporate world, a highly visible corporate social responsibility program might inadvertently give employees the psychological permission, a license, to be way less vigilant in their routine day-to-day decisions.
And running in the exact opposite direction is the slippery slope. Research consistently shows that people will accept gradually escalating dishonesty that they would absolutely reject if it was presented all at once. If a firm has sustained performance pressure, each tiny incremental step upward resets what feels normal. Because you're only comparing today's actions to yesterday's actions, rather than to your original ethical baseline, the drift remains completely hidden.
Which takes us to Section 4. When metrics displace morals. Let's talk about the real-world application of Goodhart's law and what happens when corporate incentives literally corrupt human behavior.
3.5 million.
That staggering number is the estimated amount of unauthorized customer accounts and credit cards secretly opened by Wells Fargo employees between 2011 and 2016. It is, without a doubt, one of the most famous examples of metric displacement in modern corporate history.
So how on earth did this happen? Well, the employees weren't unusually evil or dishonest. The institutional architecture literally forced it. Management set this massive 8 is great target, threatened to fire people for missing it, and offered huge bonuses for hitting it. This made the immediate goal of opening accounts so maximally salient that it completely displaced the fundamental norm of customer consent. This was a massive failure of architecture, not just a bunch of individual compliance failures.
Moving to Section 5, Groups and Role Morality. Beyond just incentives, we really need to look at how being in a crowd, or putting on a professional costume, somehow authorizes actions we would normally reject out of hand.
The psychologist Albert Bandura brilliantly mapped out how moral disengagement works in groups. Think about it. When everyone on a committee assumes someone else has already checked the ethical dimensions, no one actually does. That's diffusion of responsibility. Combine that with the presence of a legitimate authority figure, which drastically raises the threshold for refusing an unethical order, and boom, you get collective moral failure from otherwise perfectly good people. And then we have Arthur Applebaum's fascinating concept of role morality. This is basically a permission structure created when you step into a specific professional role. It totally explains how a lawyer might advance arguments they privately know are completely wrong, or an investment banker might extract massive compensation by using the specific vocabulary of their job to obscure the wrongdoing. The role itself does the ethical fading for them. It's quite literally the professional equivalent of putting on a mask.
Finally, Section 6, Designing Ethical Architecture. So here is the million-dollar question. If we can't just rely on hoping we hired good people, and if relying on endless disclosures doesn't actually work, how do we structurally design our institutions to guarantee ethical behavior? Governance design is the answer. We have to counter these cognitive biases directly by intentionally slowing down morally consequential decisions. To fight motivated reasoning, you require independent second-line challenges. To fight groupthink, you assign red team critics before a commitment is ever made. You literally have to introduce intentional, structural friction into the decision-making process. Furthermore, we have to keep a person's moral identity highly salient at the exact moment of decision. That means putting identity-activating prompts at the very start of a process, not buried at the end. And this is huge right now. We must be deeply, deeply wary of deploying AI and algorithms that automate the framing of ethical questions. When a system makes the decision and the human just clicks confirm, you risk creating ethical fading at a massive automated scale. I want to leave you with this final, vital thought. Truly understanding behavioral economics means acknowledging that ethical culture is never, ever created by some motivational slogans on a break room wall. Your institutional architecture, your metrics, your reporting channels, your daily structural defaults is either actively sustaining ethics every single day, or it is quietly dismantling them. So which one is your organization doing?